By the 1850s, the Sicilian lemon trade wasn't just farming. It was a billion-dollar global industry. The men growing this liquid gold were sitting on vast fortunes, but they were sitting ducks. This is Notorious Incorporated, the untold corporate history of Cosa Nostra. Chapter 1. The Hostile Takeover. In 1861, a monumental shift occurred. Italy was unified. But the new government was hundreds of miles away in Rome, disconnected from the harsh realities of the South. To the people of Sicily, the new state was an alien, disorganized, and heavily corrupt entity. They levied high taxes, but provided zero protection. If a rival farmer stole your lemon crop in the dead of night, or a thief burned your orchard to the ground, no police force was coming to save you. Nature abhors a vacuum, and in this total absence of law and order, ruthless men saw the ultimate corporate opportunity. The environment was ripe for a hostile takeover because of who actually owned the land. The vast majority of Sicily's wealth belonged to a few elite aristocratic families. But these barons and lords had no interest in getting their hands dirty in the soil. They preferred the luxury of their palaces in Palermo or Naples. To handle the daily operations of their massive estates, they leased the land out to middlemen. These middlemen were known as the gabellati. They were hard, violent estate managers. They paid a fixed rent to the aristocrat, and whatever profit they made on top of that, they kept. But a lemon orchard is incredibly fragile. The trees take 7 years to bear fruit. A single midnight raid by thieves could bankrupt a gabellato overnight. To guard the precious lemon groves, the gabellati hired private armies of enforcers, known as the campieri. These campieri were essentially a heavily armed private police force, riding on horseback with shotguns strapped to their backs. For a very short time, the system worked. The thieves stayed away, the lemons grew, the money flowed. But it didn't take long for the private guards to realize they held all the leverage. They were the ones with the guns. They were the ones who knew the terrain. The protectors quickly realized the real money wasn't in guarding the lemons. It was in threatening the landowners. This new criminal class was gaining immense momentum, taking over the streets and the farms, but they didn't have a name. That changed in 1863 with a wildly popular play written by Giuseppe Rizzotto called I Mafiosi della Vicaria. Rizzotto introduced the world to the word mafiosi in its modern sense. He didn't define them as mere thugs, but as men of respect, men who commanded authority through implicit, calculated violence. The term stuck. A brand was born. The true genius and sheer ruthlessness of this hostile takeover is illustrated by the terrifying experience of Dr. Gaspare Galati. Galati was a wealthy surgeon who inherited a magnificent lemon grove called the Fondo Riella in the 1870s. When Galati took over, he noticed his profits were bleeding out. He discovered that his hired warden, a man named Benedetto Carollo, was intentionally ruining the farm. Carollo was stealing the fruit and sabotaging the trees to drive the property value down, hoping to buy the land for himself at a fraction of the cost. Galati did what any normal businessman would do. He fired Carollo and hired a loyal replacement. But this wasn't a normal business. Within weeks, Galati's new warden was shot in the back and killed in the middle of the orchard. Galati, refusing to back down, hired another man. He was shot too. Galati soon received threatening letters demanding he rehire Carollo. When he went to the police, he made a horrifying discovery. The local police inspector wasn't just incompetent, he was working for the assassins. The message was clear. You cannot just hire your own muscle. You cannot go to the authorities. You have to pay the Syndicate's franchise fee. Terrified for his family's life and realizing the police were compromised, Dr. Galati fled Sicily entirely, abandoning his fortune and moving his family to Naples. Dr. Galati had been extorted, but he was one of the first landowners with the courage to document it. The rest of the farmers had no choice. They paid. This was the birth of the Pizzo, the protection racket. And it wasn't a fragmented gang operation. By the late 1800s, it was an organized regional monopoly. At the top of this monopoly were men like Antonio Giamona. Giamona was the ruthless and brilliant boss of the Uditore Cosa, or Mafia family. Giamona realized that to control the lemons, he didn't even need to steal the fruit. He just needed to control the water. Sicily is hot and arid. Lemon trees require constant, heavy irrigation. Giammona and his men physically monopolized the local water supply and aqueducts. If you paid Giammona his pizzo, your trees were watered. If you refused, your water was cut off. Your 7-year investment died in the sun, and you were driven into bankruptcy. Giammona became staggeringly wealthy. He transitioned from a poor cart driver to a man of intense political power. He didn't just rule the underworld, he guaranteed votes for corrupt politicians in Rome. In exchange, those politicians ensured the police looked the other way. The Syndicate had officially merged with the state. They began referring to themselves internally not as the Mafia, but as the Fratellanza, the Brotherhood. For decades, the Italian government denied this shadow corporation even existed. They called it a myth fabricated by Northerners. That changed between 1898 and 1900, thanks to a man named Ermanno Sangiorgi, the chief of police in Palermo. Sangiorgi was a rare breed, an honest cop. He launched a massive, multi-year undercover investigation. He interviewed informants, tracked the extortion money, and compiled a legendary 71-page document known as the Sangiorgi Report. For the first time in history, the government had a complete corporate org chart of notorious Inc. Sangiorgi's report didn't describe a loose group of street thugs. He described a highly structured syndicate with bosses, underbosses, and treasurers. He identified 8 distinct mafia families operating around Palermo, including Antonio Giammona's. In 1900, Sangiorgi executed a massive sting, arresting hundreds of suspected mafiosi and bringing them to a highly publicized trial. It was supposed to be the death blow to the organization, but the corporation had already developed its ultimate defense mechanism. When the trial began, the brave witnesses who had spoken to Sangiorgi in private suddenly suffered from amnesia. Landowners who had been violently extorted stood on the witness stand and swore they had never heard of Antonio Giammona. They looked at the men who murdered their families and told the judge they didn't recognize them. The fear of retaliation was absolute. The trial collapsed. The bosses walked free. The mafia had won. They had successfully weaponized fear to ensure absolute silence, proving they were more powerful than the Italian government itself. They had built an untouchable empire in the dirt of Sicily, and now, armed with immense wealth and a flawless corporate structure, they were preparing to export their business model across the Atlantic Ocean to the booming, vulnerable streets of America. Next week on Notorious Inc., the Syndicate formalizes its darkest rule. We open the file on Omertà, the business of silence. Subscribe and join the family.